everyone, and welcome to another episode of EmberWrite's Expert Craft Chats. Today we have a very special double-header topic, so you're going to see this episode in two parts. In the first half, we are going to be talking about dancing on that razor's edge with story structure and tension, and how to use both to make sure that your readers stay on the edge of their seats until the end of your story. Then we're going to be shifting gears and discussing a little bit about how to manage the tension between your writing life and the rest of your life, because I am sure we have all had those times that life happens and it makes managing your writing life that much more difficult. So whether you are dealing with a major life change, health issues, chronic health, or mental health, anything along those lines, we're going to be discussing how to handle those times and strategies to manage your writing life during those times as well. I'm Micah McGuire, co-founder and community lead for EmberWrite, and today I am joined by award-winning sci-fi and fantasy author Mary Robinette Kowal. Mary Robinette is the USA Today Bestselling author of 12 novels, including Apprehension and the Lady Astronaut series. A winner of the Hugo, Nebula, and Locus Awards, she is also a professional puppeteer and award-winning audiobook narrator. She co-hosts the Writing Excuses podcast, served as SFWA president, and has an asteroid named after her. Also, her cat talks. So, Mary Robinette, I am super excited to have you on, and I am personally super excited for both of these topics because I was fortunate enough to sit in on your Mice Quotient webinar during the Pikes Peak writing seminar. So, basically super excited to see where we go with structure and tension, and also, personally excited to see all of this with managing the life happens part.
I am very happy to be chatting with you about this. I loved meeting you and everyone else at Pikes Peak. So I'm always happy to talk about story.
All right, so without further ado, we will go ahead and dive right into the structure and tension side of our topic today. So just to level set for our audience, how do you personally define story structure and story tension? Because I feel like this is one of those things that everybody converges on a general definition, but we have some personal kind of tweaks and differences that vary from writer to writer.
So the thing that I've been working on for the past couple of years is thinking about sort of what is the science underneath ideas like story structure. There's a book called Salt, Fat, Acid, Heat, which is about the science beneath cooking. And I've been trying to figure out what that is for story as well. So the deeper I dive into this, the more convinced I become that structure, what we tend to talk about as structure, like 7-point plot structure, save the cat, hero's journey, that those are just recipes, actually. And those recipes have some similarities. They also have differences, but it's like saying, if you're talking about a recipe in the kitchen, every recipe must have flour. It's like, well, many recipes have flour. And if you're baking a cake, it probably has flour, but there are flourless chocolate cakes. So what I think of it is that those recipes are guidelines and they are opportunities, but that as you become more comfortable with writing, that first you start with, I need a recipe and I'm going to follow that recipe exactly. And then you're like, okay, I've got a recipe, I've got a story structure that I'm going to use, but I'm going to do some ingredient swaps based on my personal taste. And then you hit a point where you're like, what's in the pantry?
I love this metaphor because I have totally been there with cooking. So I can definitely see that, especially with a lot of the other guests that we've talked to. All makes a lot of sense.
Yes. So this is my thinking of it. So that's where I land on structure, that it's a recipe, and that there are things that help. But if we think about like what the principles of structure are, if we zoom out, like what are the principles of a good recipe, then that's where we get to tension. I think that tension is one of the principles that help drive a story, that help pull a reader through the story. And that there's a bunch of different forms of tension, and that it's one of the principles that you need to have. I think for me, the things that I've been landing on for the principles of structure, kind of the things that make something structurally sound, aren't things like the dark night of the soul. I think that does an important thing, but I think that the dark night of the soul is actually an example of contrast, and contrast is an element of tension. So for me, the things are pace, lens, order, and tension.
Okay.
Those, I think, are the principles that are underlying all of the structures.
I am really curious about the order component here, because I think this is something that whenever we had Kevin Eikenberry on, he was kind of talking about if you're trying to be a little bit edgy with the rules you're breaking and things like that. He said there are some that, yes, you can bend and you can basically get them up to their breaking point, but there are some that is simply just not going to work. He cited the example of swapping protagonists halfway through the novel or something like that. So that's really interesting. Can you elaborate more on the order side of it?
Sure. So order is, I think, driven by, there are kind of 4 controls that you can use when you're thinking about order. There's the frame, information, focus, what we're paying attention to, and the connections that we draw. So when you're thinking about framing, let's talk about this on a scene level. So a scene, the definition of a scene is just a sequence of continuous action. It doesn't actually have to have a beginning, middle, and an end, but it's just a sequence of continuous action. Real life is an unending sequence of continuous action, but in a scene, we make an artificial decision about where that begins and ends. So that's our frame. And that frame does a couple of things. It tells us things like context. You can also use symmetry so that the audience recognizes things from the beginning and the end. Then you can also use it for connection. And you can also use it to manipulate like our sense of resolution, either by having something resolve at the end or having something unresolved at the end. So that frame can do all of those things when you're thinking about order. And then with information, we're supplying the reader with information all the way through the book. And we do that to raise questions or to answer them. The order in which we supply it shapes their understanding. So if I begin a scene and the first thing that I show you is a can of Kool-Aid tipped on the side, you're like, a kitchen accident. But if the first thing that I show you is a bloody knife, then you're like, ooh, murder. And those two things can exist in the same scene. So the order in which I introduce it to you shapes the context with which you understand everything that comes after that point. And at the same time, when you exit the scene, it shapes your understanding. If you end with, now they were really screwed, then that shapes your understanding of everything that you just read as, oh, yeah. No, I see how everything's really bad. But if you end it with, but there was still hope, you're like, okay, yeah, things were bad, but I can see all of the little good pieces.
I can even see that applying to like character entrances and exits. So, but no, that is fascinating. And it's just very interesting that you brought up the point with the kind of order in the beginning, because I'm thinking about a lot of like British murder mysteries. You have cases where there's the kitchen scene that you come in and you're going, oh dear, is that tomato sauce or is that blood?
Exactly. One of the examples that I'll use of order is if you get to the end of a book, your character has multiple goals, and the goal that you end with is the thing that the reader is going to carry away from them. So if they win one goal and they lose another, you can cause the reader to relate to that book as this is a book with a happy ending versus this is a book with a sad ending, just based on the order. So if I take two goals, saving the city and getting back together. Okay, totally different books. The city was destroyed, but they had each other, versus they had each other, but the city was destroyed.
Fascinating, because we tend to hold on to whatever we begin with and whatever we end with.
Exactly. It's something that's called the recency primacy effect, which is one of the reasons that symmetry is often very useful, because you can sometimes trigger both things at the same time. So the recency primacy effect is that the first piece of information we encounter, our first impression, that's the primacy point. And the recency is the last thing we see. And those two occupy the biggest, they have the most weight, catch your attention the most. Anything in the middle, you may or may not pay attention to. So again, speaking in terms of order and sequencing, if you're writing a murder mystery and you've got a piece of information that you want to drop in a scene that's going to be a clue, but you don't want the reader to notice it, if you drop it into the middle of a paragraph in the middle of a scene, often, especially if it's like in the middle of a list, often people don't notice it at all.
Okay, I'm laughing because I'm thinking of moments from The Spare Man, that a couple of cases that I went, okay, is this going to be a clue? Is this a red herring? They didn't make much out of it, so we'll see what happens. But it's, oh, that is too funny. You would kind of, I would assume, like with your red herrings, you'd really want to direct it towards the end of the scene so you can make sure that all the attention is focused over here. So a case of kind of, watch my right hand without seeing what my left hand is doing.
Exactly. Exactly. And that brings us to one of the other pieces of order, which is focus. Which is not only where are we placing it in the scene, but how much narrative attention does it get? So, and you can control what the reader is focusing on by literally how long you talk about it.
Okay, interesting. Can you expand on that a little bit? Because I think I've seen this kind of mentioned in the context of pacing whenever we talk about, especially like people constantly discussing in fantasy, the difference between pacing for like an action or a battle scene versus pacing for like a romantic scene, something like that. And saying, obviously on the battle scene side, you want to use a lot of shorter sentences, sharper words, things like that. And you don't want to, essentially be internalized for too long.
I was just going to grab a piece of text to give a demonstration with. It is absolutely also related to pacing, and there's a lot of overlap between these things. But one of the things about that narrative time that we spend is because the audience is literally, they just have to read more words. They are spending more time on it. They notice it more. So there's this thing by Ray Bradbury that I deeply, deeply love. That's a great example of this idea of narrative focus. And it's both how many words we're spending on a thing and also the kinds of words we're spending on it. So these are flourishes like adjectives, clauses, anything that draws the reader's attention to it. So Ray Bradbury has a short story called The Fruit at the Bottom of the Bowl. And it opens up with, I'm going to just read the first kind of 2 paragraphs. William Acton rose to his feet. The clock on the mantel ticked midnight. So those are 2 very short sentences. And it just gives you, there's this person, there's a clock on a mantel, but it doesn't tell you anything about what that clock is. The important thing is the clock on the mantel ticked midnight. He looked at his fingers and he looked at the large room around him and he looked at the man lying on the floor. William Acton, whose fingers had stroked typewriter keys and made love and fried ham and eggs for early breakfasts, had now accomplished a murder with those same 10 whirled fingers.
Oh,
so
wow.
Right. I mean, first of all, Bradbury.
Yeah.
But what he does there is in that second paragraph, he looked at his fingers. And then he looked at the large room around him. The large room around him has more narrative. So we start this very close thing. We go a little bit bigger, more words, a large room around him. And then he looked at the man lying on the floor, much more. Man lying on the floor is extremely important. But then we circle back and he spends a lot of time talking about his hands. So even though he doesn't say he looked at his hand, it doesn't say that his gaze came back to his hands. But that's absolutely what he's doing with that narrative by having us spend more time there. And this is the problem when you see purple prose. It's usually not a problem with any particular metaphor or simile or, whatever someone is doing. It is that there's so many in there that you no longer know where to look.
Interesting. So it's almost like I'm thinking of Rococo interior design where
Exactly.
It's so overwhelming that you don't even know where to let your eye rest.
Right. So if I go back to those first 2 sentences, William Acton rose to his feet. The clock on the mantel ticked midnight. Imagine if instead it was William Acton slowly and carefully rose to his feet, body trembling. The Rococo clock on the heavy marble mantel ticked midnight with a resonant gong. Like, you're like, where are we looking? And then by the time we get to that thing about his fingers had stroked typewriter keys and made love and fried ham, like that is just vanishes.
Right. Because the punch is lost amid all the other stuff.
Correct. So when you're thinking about where to put these flourishes, this narrative attention, you're thinking about the importance of something, and that then is also going to affect the order in which you decide to do things. So if it's really important, you're going to want to place that beginning, end of a sentence or a paragraph, scene, chapter. It's pretty fractal.
Mm-hmm.
If it's less important, You're going to want to remove some of those flourishes. You're going to want to put it in the middle. You're going to want to back off, give yourself less narrative attention.
And I guess just talking about all of these different elements, at what point do writers need to be thinking about these things? Is there an order in which you need to be considering the elements? Because I know with story structure, we've gotten a couple of different experts and writers on that have said, hey, it's great if you can have some of it built out at the beginning, but you don't have to have it all built out when it comes to your structure. And I'm sure, even just getting down to like the narrative flourishes, things like that, I'm sure those are things that like you could be on your next to last editing round before you're really even considering those. So like, what is your suggestion for where these things need to fall into place as far as it fitting into your writing order?
It depends on your brain. It depends on your brain, and it depends on the story. I am very, very strongly of the opinion that process does not matter except for the ease and joy that it gives you. Like, again, using cooking as an example, you can go in and go, what's in the pantry? And improvisationally cook your way through and make something delicious. You can also do a what's in the pantry, and then you prep all of your things ahead of time. You chop all the stuff. You can come in with a recipe and you have planned it out. Even if it's a recipe you've made up, you can plan it out. You can do it all. And at the end of the day, once it's plated and on the table, the audience and reader does not know or care what your process is. They just care about whether or not it's delicious. So if it is delicious and it, in plating terms, if it looks good, if it's pleasing to the senses, doesn't matter how you got there. Doesn't matter how long it took you. You can prep one day, you can write another. You can do both at the same time. The way I think about it is that these are tools, and you can either use it to prep or you can use it to diagnose and repair. And doesn't matter.
Do you think there's a way that we can figure out what we're more comfortable with? Because first of all, I love the answer about it depending on your brain, because this is kind of, the topic that I have kind of been on my soapbox about with EmberWrite, is that it needs to be something that is flexible. It needs to be something that doesn't force you into a box, but it doesn't need to overwhelm you with options either. So that was the entire principle behind how we built EmberWrite. And guys, you need time to brainstorm. You need time to think about things. It can't always be you sit down at the keyboard and basically type. So I love that answer, but I am curious if there's ways to start figuring out where you kind of fall. Is it just a matter of trial and error and just doing it over and over again?
Yeah. If you don't think of it as trial and error, if you think of it as practice, it's just practice. Every skill is just practice. My opinion is that talent is the ability to recognize a mistake and correct it. But I don't think it matters how long it takes you to correct that mistake. There's a wonderful artist, James A. Owen, who deep into his career as a professional artist was in a horrible car accident and had to relearn how to draw. And what he said was that he would put a line down, and it wasn't the right line, but it gave him information about where the right line should be. And that he just kept putting lines down until he got the line in the right spot. That is what we do as writers. And the more experience you have, the easier it is to know where that right line is, the easier it is to get your hand to do the thing, to get your brain to do the thing. But I can tell you, as someone who's, pretty deep into my career, that I make the same mistakes. It's just that I can usually correct them before they're on the page. But my brain will still offer them to me.
And just to apply another example here, I played violin when I was younger, and my teacher was a cellist who actually studied under Pablo Casals.
Ooh.
And I had been away for a very long time. I came back to my teacher. I don't know what to do. He goes, well, do you know what Casals did? So he had a period of time where he was unable to practice, ended up getting back into it, and I just saw him doing scales one day. And I was going, well, why are you doing scales? He's like, because you have to know the basics. You have to have the basics mastered no matter what, even with a virtuoso cellist like Casals. If you're going to try to get back into it, again, it's very similar to that, just putting down the right line. So I think this applies across all arts. And I don't think writers should think of themselves as the exception here, because I think we put a lot of undue pressure on ourselves because we sit here and go, oh my gosh, I wasted all these words, or I wasted all this time, or I trunked that novel. And I feel like we're one of the only arts that really stress out about the practice and treat the practice like not what it is, which is practice.
Yeah. Jonathan Mayberry, who's won like billion awards and been on the bestseller lists a billion times. He said that, I assume he still does this because he said he'd been doing it for years, that his writing practice in the morning is that he will write the first page of a new project. And then if he's still thinking about it later, he may write more of it. But it's just a practice of just a writing exercise. Just how do I introduce characters? How do I introduce tension? How do I do some world building in just a page? Like 250 words-ish. And I was like, that's such a good practice. One of the things that I do sometimes when I'm waiting someplace is that I will capture sensory details. I will just describe the room that I'm in without worrying about there being a narrative to it. And I think that there's a bunch of different things that you can do to practice. Like you can practice order just by moving sentences around. You can practice narrative focus by saying, okay, what happens if I go all in on the description of this one thing, this one detail? You were talking about battle scenes before and the idea that they should usually contain shorter sentences. Yes, but I've also read the slow-mo battle where there's a single moment that gets really, really stretched. So what happens if you take a bullet hitting something and you write it with as few sentences and a few words as you can? And what happens if you try to stretch that bullet impact out over 2 paragraphs? Like what does that do? And I think anytime you know, oh, this is what that tool does, this is what the opposite ends of that tool does, that opens up that whole spectrum to you. And it's not that you have to do it every time that way. It's not that you have to be thinking about it consciously all the time. It's that in those moments where the inspiration isn't striking, where you're not just in the moment, you can say, okay, what do I reach for right now? Where is the tool that I'm going to use?
And knowing the right tool in your toolbox to reach for.
Yeah. And sometimes knowing that it's the wrong tool, but it's the way you're going to use it. I mean, we've all used a butter knife to unscrew something.
Okay, that's a great way to look at it. That's perfect. With tension especially, does this tend to change fundamentally on a genre level? Or is this a case of all tension is tension and it's all going to kind of run us along the same lines? Or do you approach it differently and say, like, I always think of some of the like very, high action packed genres tend to be sci-fi, fantasy, thriller, adventure, anything along those lines, versus something maybe more like contemporary or romance that may not be as action packed for the genre overall?
I think tension is tension. I think audience expectations for what kind of tension they want to be experiencing and how much tension, that does change. Okay, but the tools that you use to manipulate the tension, I think, are the same.
Okay, all right. So I do want to go off a tangent a bit about the types of tension in just a minute, but let's talk about those tools that we use to manipulate tension. Are there specific ones that we tend to reach for often versus ones that may not be used as much?
Yeah. So tension, I think, falls into 4 to 5, depending on how you want to categorize it, categories. There's anticipation, juxtaposition, questions, conflicts, and then microtension is the one. It's like you can call it another form of tension or just a smaller version of these things. So with each of those, when you're looking at them, like conflict is the one that we teach. And I think the reason we teach it is because it's easy to teach because it's external. You can very easily point at things. So to increase tension through conflict, you have people fight or disagree or struggle. And to reduce conflict through tension, then you do things like de-escalating. They agree, they cope well. And sometimes you want to escalate, you want to make things more tense, but sometimes you actually need to de-escalate. Like if the crux of the story, if the through line is these 2 characters, the enemies to friends or enemies to lovers, at some point they have to agree and get along, and so you have to de-escalate tension. So you have to de-escalate the conflict between them, which then often means that you have to replace that tension with something else if you're not using conflict. So juxtaposition is a contrast between two elements. This is the thing we see in a lot of films where it's like big fight scene, dramatic classical music, like lovely, lovely, beautiful song while terrible things are happening. It can be a poor friend arriving and feeling the contrast it means. It's the moment when the protagonist in a horror movie makes a joke and you're like, oh boy, I'm real sorry. That monster is about to jump at you right now. So to increase tension, you can introduce a contrasting element or a contrasting scene. And to reduce tension, you can create what Edgar Allan Poe called unity of effect, or alignment. You can make things more similar. And then when you're thinking about unanswered questions, like we think about those as driving a mystery, but they also drive a romance. Like, how are they going to get together? They're going to get together, but how are they going to when are they going to kiss? Like, what is the brooding hero's backstory? Why is he so brooding? So to create tension, you interrupt a question before we get the answer. You can pose a story question that has multiple possible answers. You can also use red herrings, and not just in mystery. You can use them in other areas. Like I can have a character say, "Are you just checking to see if I'm taking my meds?" And the story is not about the medication. It's not about any of those things, but it raises this question in the back of the reader's head. Why are they taking medication?
Yeah. I actually think back to your mice lecture, and I think back to describing Pride and Prejudice as a mystery in which the question is Mr. Darcy a jerk?
Yeah. Yes, exactly. And so to reduce tension, you answer questions or you avoid raising the question in the first place.
Okay, that's fascinating, because I think that's a really interesting way to look at tension, because I think we so often do default to conflict. That can be hard, especially whenever, like you mentioned, sometimes you have to let the tension ebb a little bit, just because if you're constantly battering your reader with more and more conflict, it's just going to get exhausting. So you have to have those breath moments. I'm assuming with those moments, those would be the times that you would rely on kind of the other subtler types of tension, I would assume, kind of keep your reader interested and keep your reader hooked.
Exactly. So that's where you would be reaching for the juxtaposition or the anticipation. And unanswered questions and anticipation are just a little bit different. Unanswered questions are very much the, I want to know more about that. Anticipation is Alfred Hitchcock. He talks about the difference between surprise and suspense. And in surprise, a bomb goes off in a kitchen. But in suspense, you show the bomb under the table and then you pull back and you watch someone going through their regular day. Nothing is going wrong in that regular day, but you know that there's a problem because you're waiting for that bomb to go off.
Right. So the reader has this dread and this anxiety about what's going to happen, and is the person going to get out before it goes off? Okay, that's a very, very good example to kind of touch back to the kinds of expected tension in different genres. Obviously, I can kind of see how, certain genres would lend themselves to certain types of tension. So I could see suspense, action, adventure, horror, all really leaning on like anticipation very heavily, because you're waiting for the, monster jump scare, things like that. And I guess with kind of where does that fall? Do certain genres tend to rely more on juxtaposition or rely more on unanswered questions that are not, obviously like mystery is going to be very much about unanswered questions?
Yeah, great question. So I should pause to just do a slight definition thing that for me, when I'm thinking about genre, that I think that there's kind of two basic camps. There's structure-driven genres, which are driven by a recipe. And then there's aesthetic-driven genres, which are driven by mood, feel, set dressing. So science fiction fantasy does not have an inherent structure. It is driven by set dressing. But murder mystery, romance, like a romance has to have a happily ever after. You have to have a meet cute. Like those things have to be there in order for it to be recognizably that genre. But you can take a structure genre and an aesthetic genre and you can marry them. You can use them at the same time. So there are some structure-driven genres that I think are more heavily driven by some pieces than others. Like mystery is driven by questions. It just, that the whole thing is like whodunit. Thrillers, their tension is very much that anticipation, but it's also very heavily driven by conflict. There are bad people doing bad things. So those tend to be the major drivers, but you can still use juxtaposition in any of those, and you can use it to ramp up a scene. So you can take a scene that there's questions that are happening, and you can add some juxtaposition to it. There's a great show on, I think it's Netflix, called The Residents. It's a murder mystery series set in the White House. It's fantastic. This is not a spoiler, but it is a scene that happens in the last episode. There's a scene in which the detective's sidekick is on the phone with the detective, and we are getting information. So we're getting these questions, and these questions are being answered. We've been building. These questions are being answered, but we know that there's also anticipation for the consequences of those questions. So those things are happening. The thing that the writers do is they add this juxtaposition to it, which is that he's getting all of this information through a phone call while he is with his kindergarten daughter on a little miniature train in a park. So he's sitting on this tiny train car with his knees up, like in front of his face, trying to have a conversation and ask questions about a murder without alarming any of the children or parents in front or behind him. And it's just this beautiful juxtaposition of circumstances with everything else that's happening that just ratchets the tension up in what is otherwise basically an exposition scene.
Wow. And I'm thinking, how anticipation might apply. I'm actually thinking of The Night Manager. I'm going to try not to do spoilers here, but there's a reveal in the second season that you get built up to. And then it just comes in this one lightning bolt moment that you hear someone speak and you go, oh no. And it's just this instant, it's amazingly done. So that's another great recommendation. I will have to go look up The Residents as well.
Yeah, it's so
fantastic.
Good. And then you can also do a thing where you use juxtaposition and anticipation at the same time, which is that we anticipate one thing, but the thing that actually happens is the opposite of that. So Ted Lasso is a great example of this. I love Ted Lasso, particularly the Christmas episode, which begins season 2. And I think you can watch it without having watched season 1, but it's better with the context. And also it's a great show. But at the beginning of this show, Ted, who is going through a divorce, it's Christmas. He's not going home for the first time. And he's watching It's a Wonderful Life, and he has whiskey. So the thing that we are anticipating, where we think this thing is headed, and we're a little bit nervous, is that we're going to get It's a Wonderful Life version, that Ted is going to see what the world looks like if he's not there. But that's not what happens. What happens is that another character, Rebecca, knocks on his window and says, "Come give toys away with me." And so he steps out of the It's a Wonderful Life and he starts to head off with Rebecca. And what happens for most people is, oh no, this is going to be the thing where they fall in love and they have a thing because he's been drinking and it's Christmas and it's romance. And so you're anticipating, and like most people that I know do not want this to happen because their friend relationship is so great. And so you're waiting for that to happen. And they juxtapose it. They don't deliver that, even though everything is set up and pointing that direction. What they do is they give toys away and then they go and join another party. And you're so relieved and so happy about it that they're creating this tension in an episode where literally nothing goes wrong.
That's too funny. Okay, that is actually hilarious. And I think that kind of touches on one of my questions, which is controlling the tension whenever you have it ebb, or just learning how to control it well, because that seems like that would be very, very hard to pull off, is that you have an episode that nothing goes wrong, but you still have people on the edge of their seats.
Yeah. So one of the things that I was an art major in college, and one of the things that one of my art instructors said was, if you want to make something brighter, you put something dark next to it. And that's one of the things that you can do when you are creating tension in these things, is that you can think about, what contrast can I provide? It's how can I How can I make this dark scene darker by having a moment of levity in it? How can I make this happy scene happier by having one moment of sadness in it, or make that one moment of sadness bigger because it's surrounded by all this happiness? And so you can think about these things. You can think about them before you start writing by saying, what is my source of tension? You can also do it as a diagnostic when you come back and you're like, why is this scene a little bit flat? What is my source of tension? Or can I ramp it up by adding in some juxtaposition? Can I ramp it up by putting a little bit of an unanswered question in there? And again, those unanswered questions don't have to be big. It can just be as simple as, are you here to check to see if I'm taking my meds? That unanswered question. And sometimes even if you're planning to answer it in the scene, just don't put it right next to the question that was asked. You can just sometimes delay it, so then you get unanswered question plus anticipation by delaying that answer.
I'm trying to think of scenes I've recently had a problem writing, and I'm going, well, maybe I need to go back and look at my source of tension there. So, gosh, that makes complete sense. Okay, I guess along with all of this, what's the hardest part about tension? Is it basically just learning to control it? Is it, specifically, because I know a lot of authors go to, nobody likes dealing with the messy middle and all of that. Is it a specific part? What is it about it that's probably the hard part to learn?
Honestly, the hard part is learning to do a variety of tension. The thing that we will do, I think, as writers is, I understand how this works, and then just keep using the same thing over and over. It's fine to have a lot of conflict, but if it's a story that only has conflict, that conflict begins to be meaningless, in much the same way that I was talking about with Bradbury, where if you have a lot of adjectives, a lot of verbal flourishes, they all become meaningless. So thinking about learning what your defaults are, that probably is one of the hard things. And the other thing that I would say kind of as a writer is, in general, and this goes with the tension thing as well, is learning to just trust your own taste on this. Like, we spend our entire life honing our skill at our taste, honing our taste as a reader. And then when we're writing, we forget that taste applies still. Like, we're writing something to be read by someone who is like us. So everything that we've learned about what we like and we don't like applies to the things that we write. And so, like, as much as I talk about all these tools, you asked me earlier, like, when should you deploy this? In an ideal world, I don't think you should consciously deploy any of these. In an ideal world, you've internalized them and you are just writing on vibes and emotion. You're just experiencing the thing. All of these tools are there for when the inspiration isn't there.
Gotcha. I'm thinking of, we've had a couple of other guests that have talked about, practice for this. So like they talk about outlining methods and saying, hey guys, give it at least 2 weeks. And basically if it's not working for you after 2 weeks, then you can look back and say, okay, what's working for me and what's not. How do you start learning these new tools and practicing this stuff without either A, making a mess of the current work that you're working on, especially if you're working on like a deadline or something like that, and B, without it becoming like your new favorite shiny toy that basically you go, oh, I've learned this, I'm now going to use this in every single new scene, and you forget about whatever your original default was.
Yeah. So there's a couple of different tools, exercises, tricks. Sometimes, and I did this a lot, especially when I was early on, and I will still do this, just not as consistently, that when I sit down in a session, I'm like, I'm going to focus on this skill. And I'm going to put everything else on easy setting, because like I can focus on this skill and I say, I'm just going to focus on finding juxtapositions to add, or I'm just going to focus on dialogue, or I'm just going to focus on setting. The thing is that just because I write it down that way in that exercise, in that pass, doesn't mean that I can't come back and fine tune it and add other things in. So it's okay to just focus on something for a session. And then in the next session, you focus on a different thing. Or maybe you say for a week or 2 weeks, this is the thing I'm going to focus on until I feel like I've got it. And then I'm going to focus on something else. Once it's internalized and you're like, okay, then you can layer in, you can add another skill. And that first skill is still going to be there. It's still going to be riding along. So that's thing one. The other exercise, this one is super fun, I find. Grab a piece of printed fiction, like somebody else's published fiction, and say, okay, the thing I'm going to do with this page is I'm going to look for, or this chapter is I'm going to look for every form of juxtaposition that exists in this, and I'm going to delete it. And then look at how that reads. Do that with every unanswered question. Just pull them out, see what it does. And that then will tell you what those sentences were really doing. You can then also look at, because if you do it in print, and I know defacing a book, you can photocopy it, you can take a picture and do it on the screen, you can, however it is, you can deface a book. I won't tell. But the thing that you can then also do is that you can look at how the author is sprinkling it through the scene, which gives you a visual sense of, oh, okay, that's about how often I should be doing this. Or what happens if I do it this often? And you can do it in different kinds of scenes. Like here's a really tense scene. Here's a more mellow scene. And languid, slower pacing scenes, those aren't bad. It's just they're doing a different thing. It's like saying soup is bad because it's not a cake.
Hey, that is a completely fair way to look at it. Because I think especially a lot of more intermediate writers get so caught up in, oh, I have to have conflict, I have to have tension, basically kind of overdo it a little bit. I feel like that metaphor makes perfect sense. It's like you can't blame soup just because it's not cake. I mean, it's two totally different things. So,
yeah.
Oh, wow. Okay. I think along those lines, do you have any favorite resources or other favorite exercises that you like to do for tension?
Honestly, I would say as an exercise, watch Ted Lasso, because tension in Ted Lasso very rarely comes from conflict. And it's really interesting when you start paying attention to it. It's really, really interesting to watch. The other thing that I would say is read a piece of fiction that is a work in translation from a non-English speaking country, because like Japanese literature does not approach conflict or story structure in the way most Western culture does. And so if you read a short story or a novel, and you look at where are the sources of tension, what is the motivator, what is pulling people through the plot, if you go into it and if you're going and you look for cake, these stories don't work. So if you look for, oh, it doesn't have an inciting incident, those are all pieces of a recipe. But if you go in and you look for what is my reason to care, what is pulling me through the story, if you look for those, you're like, oh, this is that piece. And it gives you another way to think about and approach your own fiction. Those are probably two of my favorite ways of thinking about things, and not getting locked down into a narrow definition of what story is.
Okay, fabulous, fabulous.